So that gives you an idea about what social listening is. Now, how can we use this within our research? So I'm going to start by presenting you the classic research onion, which you may have come across, which I've adapted from Saunders et al. And really, it's the outer layer that I want to start off here. In social listening, you can actually be or utilize any of the philosophical paradigms that are out there. You could be a positivist, you could be an interpretivist, you could be a constructivist, you could be a pragmatist. You could use any of those. Like some research methodologies, it's more suited to others, but this domain is so big that actually it doesn't really matter which paradigm you adopt, it will fit in there somehow. Now, I actually personally believe, because it's so wide, you will be doing a mixed or multi-method approach. So pragmatism is probably the preferred method if you are adopting a social listening approach, because actually it covers so many different things, and it gives you almost an opportunity to triangulate your research and to get to the bottom and identify specific bits of information that you're looking to research upon. Now, what do we want to establish when we're doing social listening? Here is just some things, and it's just a few that sort of like spring to mind. The classic is, from a qualitative point of view, is to identify themes. So when you're embarking on social listening, you can quite easily identify specific themes. When you're embarking on social listening, you can adopt a more quantitative positivist approach and do a variety of statistical analysis. You may want to adopt some form of social network analysis, and here the shape or structure of the social system becomes important. You know, sometimes if you are a political marketeer or a political researcher, you might be looking at critical events that have happened. You might be looking at some sort of stabilization, destabilization aspects that are happening within the community. From a practice or a practical point of view, it's a way of identifying influences. And another important avenue of research, which is really growing at the moment, is this concept of fake news or disruption. Using social listening is an ideal mechanism for identifying this sort of fake news or disruptive aspect that is happening within the outer sphere, as it were. Now, let's look at some of the methods that can be employed in a bit more detail. So we're going to drill down into the research onion in a bit more detail and look at some of the aspects. So there are two slides for this, looking at some of the things that you can utilize when doing social listening. So first one, big data analysis. Big data analysis. So so far, with my climate change research that I'm doing just over a year now, I've got 4 million lines of data, and I'm still at the moment struggling a bit. Actually, how am I going to deal with all this? But there are obviously ways of doing this. But 4 million lines of data over a year to analyze. You can't really get that through any other sources per se. You know, social listening is an ideal mechanism for getting big data to analyze. You can do case studies, and I'll show you some example of the case studies that I've done. You know, focus on brands or terms that are out there, so it can be real focus case studies. Content analysis, ethnography, grounded theory, all sort of linked together or within the qualitative element of that. They can all be done. Now, if you're a quants person. You could do some sort of correlation analysis from this. You can do controlled experiments or randomized controlled trials in here. And within industry, this is done a lot. You may have heard of A/B testing. I work a lot with small businesses in the UK, and we do a lot of A/B testing on adverts. If I just change the name or the strap line for an email marketing campaign that goes up, what sort of response will I get? And that's a sort of an experiment that you could do in here. So it's a great way of doing that. Participant observation, I talked about earlier on, and actually the phenomenology, that's very much linked to content analysis, etc. I touched briefly on grounded theory, and yes, you can actually do grounded theory using social listening. So as another really important avenue to focus on. Now you might see up there, why has he got field research in green? Well, my argument is that actually whenever you do social listening, it is a field research exercise. So you'll be doing field research which will touch on one or many of these different aspects to it. And then in there you've got interviews. You can do one-to-one interviews in the process, or group interviews within social listening as well. And just to expand on that, you can do population analysis, primary data analysis. Now, I have had people who say, well, you're doing social listening, that's secondary data analysis. It's not really, because actually you've got to do a lot of work in actually collecting the data. Secondary data analysis is where you are reviewing data that's already been cleaned. And what we'll see is actually one of the most important things about the social listening process is cleaning the data before you analyze it. I touched on quantitative a bit earlier on. I'll give you an example of a quantitative when I go through the past research studies that I've done before. And random control trials are very much linked to experiments. Surveys, another thing, you can direct people to surveys, but probably the most important, well, not important, but new areas of research is right at the bottom, the visual methodologies. There's a new strain of research coming in, or a more in-depth, because actually visual methodology has been going on for a while, but you can look at big data, particularly if you're focusing on Instagram or TikTok. How do you analyze in detail the photographs or the videos or the images in there, particularly if there's lots, but there are ways that you can do that, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. So these are the sort of things you can embark on in social listening, and hopefully, and I think looking very briefly at the papers that are going to be presented today and tomorrow, most of these have been covered in here. So it's a great way of actually expanding your research portfolio and going through this in a little bit more detail if you want to embark on social listening. Now, one of the key benefits of social listening is a reduction in bias. And what we mean by that is the Hawthorne effect, and some of you may have come across the Hawthorne effect, and another way of looking at it, or you may have heard of the white coat syndrome. And this is really where when researchers embark on a piece of or a study, the subjects that are being reviewed will change their behaviors, and so you're not always getting the right idea. Now, the caveat for this is that in social listening, this is only really through passive listening, because actually when you do active social listening, you are engaging with the participants, and so the Hawthorne fact comes into play, because they know what's happening in there. And a classic example that I share with most my students and other practitioners when I'm doing seminars like this is I talk about the process of going to the doctors, and when the doctor asks, how many glasses of wine do you drink? And I always cut back and not actually give them the full amount, but because it's me saying, well, actually, I don't want to tell them how much I really drink. I'll make it look as if I'm really good. And that's the sort of behavior that happens sometimes in researchers. People don't want to share exactly what they do out there. And another caveat from this is that we know how they behave, but we don't always know how they think. And this is where actually doing the active social listening can get a better idea of the thinking. But at least you are knowing how people behave. So that is essentially the sorts of things that you can do within social listening per se. Now, let's have a look at some of the ethical aspects and the legal aspects to this. So within the social listening process, there are a number of factors that you need to consider. First of all, it's the ethics, and second is the legislation. Now, ethics linked to autonomy, privacy, confidentiality, and I'll go through this in a little bit more detail. BPS, the British Psychological Society's Code of Human Research Ethics. Now that's really where I base a lot of my work on, and this really states that observational research is only acceptable in public situations where those observed would expect to be observed by strangers. So in theory, you can go out and sit on a street corner and let's say, how do people use a pedestrian crossing? You can sit there and do research about that. And because it's in a public situation and you're seeing people out there and people would expect you to be or expect to be observed, as it were, you don't necessarily have to ask their permission to do this. However, if you were to go inside a school or into an office building and you want to view how people are doing specific things, you have to get, obviously, permission from the organisation that is part of and the participants in there. Now, what BPPS Code of Research and their Internet Mediated Research guidelines state that certain platforms like social media or forum threads where people go on it and they expect to be observed by strangers, a lot of people are out there saying, yeah, here, look at me, look at me, look at me. You can do research without actually having to get their permission. So that's great. So essentially everything on social media, if it's in the open, and what I mean by that is that if we go to Facebook, because that's probably the most easier to put this example in. If you consider Facebook and you look at pages which are open to the public, or groups of individuals like your family, etc., who you are friends with, you can do research on the public area, but really if you're doing research around your family and friends who are within a closed group, you have to get permission to do that. So just because it's on social media, if it's behind a locked door, as it were, where you need a password or to be invited to get in, then you have to get permission to observe the content. But other than that, if you're looking specifically at people on Twitter or Instagram or TikTok or whatever, you don't specifically need their consent to do it. Now, the question of anonymity comes into play, and I've seen as a review for articles, and I've actually seen articles which have been published as well. People are presenting the handles. So when I talk about a Twitter handle, it's their username. In research, the question of anonymity is paramount. Now, if you look at the terms and conditions, and I'm going to touch on the terms and conditions a bit with platforms like Twitter, they actually say that, yeah, you can share that with the general public. So if you're looking on media platforms like the BBC or Fox News or Sky News or something like that, and there's something that's happened on Twitter, they will present that data, and you're there, which you can be picked up on. Now, that doesn't deal with the ethical aspect. So in theory, you should, out of courtesy and ethics approval, get permission if you're going to use the handle names or the user names. Otherwise, very much like you would do in, let's say, focus groups or one-to-one interviews, you have to give them a pseudonym. So you can still do research, but you can't specifically name the individuals. You also have to be a little bit careful about presenting a tweet because you might have to rewrite it and explain that you're rewriting it, because if you copy and paste exactly what's rewritten, it could still be found later on, so the anonymity goes. Much of this aspect is going to be down to your own university's ethics committee and what they ask you to do, because actually I've seen, even in publications, some journals have accepted people who have presented their handles. I personally would reject it or ask them to make it anonymous. You will not lose out if you do make it anonymous, but you may have to change things if you don't. So that's an important aspect to consider. Now, if we look at the terms and conditions here, Twitter's latest terms and conditions, what they're actually saying is that the tweets that and the retweets that actually can be syndicated, broadcasted, distributed through any media service or whatever. So that's really what I was talking about earlier on, but it doesn't deal with the ethics around that. So Twitter have said that sign up to Twitter, use it, and your data will be presented out in the public. So just be aware of that. Now, Reddit, I don't know whether any of you have come across Reddit. Reddit is a great big forum, mainly used in the States. And they talk about all sorts of different subjects. Their terms and conditions are slightly different. You can see at the bottom of the red here, they say that it can be syndicated, broadcasted, distributed only by individuals who partner with Reddit. Now, you might be thinking, oh, I'd like to work with them. All you need to do is get permission from them. Say, I'm doing a piece of research, blah, 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 blah. Is it all right if I share some of the information? But again, I would anonymize that data or rephrase the data so it's covered in that way. So you can see that depending on the platform you're on, the terms are slightly different. And we see the same sort of thing within Facebook. Now, Facebook actually have an area for researchers and academics. Although it's actually quite hard to get in there and actually get to talk to them, a number of times I've actually been in contact, but they haven't come back to me. So it is a little bit difficult. I think they tend to use some of the bigger universities or whatever, or maybe some of the US universities. But if you search for the Facebook's research portal, you can see the sort of things that they've got here that they would do with the academics in the future. So that's ethics. So anonymity and confidentially is really key. And if you're doing social listening, it's not so important. Now we come on to legislation. First thing to consider is copyright. Now, when I was here last year, I spoke in quite depth about copyright, so I'm not going to go into too much detail there. What I will say that from an academic point of view or research point of view, as long as it's for academic research, not business research, you have some rights in specific countries that you can capture data and use it for academic research. So there shouldn't be too much of an issue there. Again, what I would always say is that it's always best to try and get permission. However, you do have the backup of fair use, as it were, to use for academic research. Now, the other key thing I wanted to touch upon is web scraping. Web scraping is essentially using platforms like Python. Some of you may have come across Python, which is a piece of software that allows you to go into things like Facebook or LinkedIn or any, and actually scrape the data rather than using the API or having to pay out lots of money for the licenses to use the partners that I showed earlier on. Now, if I'm a reviewer and an article comes in and says that the study is based on web scraping and they haven't got permission to do web scraping from the company, or even if it's a PhD doing their Viva and I'm an examiner doing that and they haven't got, then it would be rejected or it'll be failed, because you are essentially breaking the law there. And as a reviewer and for the journal in question, they could become liable, because most of these platforms have a specific line within their terms and conditions saying that you can't do web scraping unless you ask permission for it. So just be wary of that. So you can do use the APIs, which I will talk about a little bit later on, through those various platforms that I showed you to capture data. But using web scraping and platforms like Python could lead you into some deep hot water. So I've covered the sorts of things that researchers can embark upon, and I've covered some of the ethical and legislations related to it.